Here's a wild thought for you. What if I told you that a card-carrying British conservative would probably feel more at home in the US Democratic Party than with the Republicans? It sounds completely backward, right? But believe it or not, there's a lot of truth to it. Today, we're going to unpack exactly why the single word conservative means two fundamentally different things depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on. So let's just dive right in. What does it actually mean to be a conservative? It's a label that gets thrown around constantly in the news and conversations. But the answer? Well, it's way more complicated than you might think, and it changes dramatically depending on where you are in the world. I mean, just look at the popular image of each. In the US, you hear conservative and you immediately think of individual liberty, religious faith, low taxes, and small government. But in the UK, it's a different story. We're talking about a focus on tradition, social order, and they even embrace things like a national health service. So how can one word represent such opposite ideas? Well, the answer, as it so often does, is hiding in the history books. To really get to the bottom of this, we've got to travel back in time. And we're going to start our journey in the United States, where, as you'll see, the story of conservatism is just full of fascinating paradoxes. This quote from Professor James Kurth just hits the nail on the head. He calls American conservatism an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. And when you stop and think about it, he's got a point. What exactly were early Americans trying to conserve in a country that was literally born from a revolution? Right. This is the absolute key to the whole puzzle. European conservatives were all about preserving the old way of doing things. The monarchy, the landed aristocracy, an official state church. But America didn't have any of that stuff to begin with. It was a brand new country, a blank slate, created specifically to get away from that old world order. So if American conservatives weren't trying to conserve a traditional hierarchical society, what were they conserving? Well, they were conserving the radical ideas that fueled the revolution itself. And those ideas have a name: classical liberalism. This was the big political philosophy of the 18th century, and it was all about individual liberty, free markets, and keeping government power in check. So get this. In a truly ironic twist of history, the job of American conservatives became to protect and defend a liberal revolution. Their whole mission wasn't about holding on to an ancient past. It was about preserving the groundbreaking and, at the time, very liberal ideas of the Founding Fathers. But hang on, this story doesn't end there. As we move into the 20th century, a totally new form of American conservatism starts to take shape. It's a complicated alliance, an often contradictory coalition that has really defined American politics ever since. The best way to understand modern American conservatism is to think of it as this three-legged stool. You got one leg, the economic conservatives. They're all about free enterprise, pro-business policies. The second leg is the religious and social conservatives, focused on traditional values. And the third leg is the security conservatives, who champion a strong military and a patriotic, assertive foreign policy. For a long time, this worked. Back in the 80s, Ronald Reagan masterfully brought these three groups together, creating an incredibly powerful political force. But here's the million-dollar question. Was this coalition ever really stable? Professor Kurth argues no, not really. He says it was always more of a marriage of convenience, and that the business conservatives were always the ones in charge. And as he points out, this often meant that the other two legs of the stool, the social and security conservatives, kind of got the short end of the stick, with their goals often taking a backseat to economic priorities. And this is where the cracks really start to show. The very things that economic conservatives champion, like globalization and free trade, can actually undermine the values of the other two groups. Think about it. The creative destruction of global capitalism can weaken the very fabric of the traditional communities that social conservatives want to protect. The decline of manufacturing jobs in the Rust Belt is a perfect example of this tension. It's a conflict baked right into the heart of the movement. Okay, so that's the American story. A tale of revolution, weird paradoxes, and constant internal tension. But what's going on across the Atlantic? Let's hop across the pond to Britain, because the story of conservatism there is, well, very different indeed. To help us understand British conservatism, we're going to lean on the work of Onward, one of the most interesting and influential think tanks on the British right today. They argue that British conservatism isn't just a watered-down version of the American model. No, it's its own unique, pragmatic philosophy, one that's been shaped by Britain's own specific history and challenges. I think this quote from Onward's Tim Pitt really captures the spirit of British conservatism. He's warning against just falling back on the comfort blanket of old ideologies, specifically the free market ideas from the Thatcher years. For British conservatives, the goal isn't to stick to some rigid, unchanging rulebook. It's to adapt, to evolve, and to do what actually works for the country at that moment in time.
So what does this pragmatic conservatism actually look like? Well, Onward lays out 4 key principles. First, pragmatism. Just focus on what works in the real world, not what some theory says should work. Second, stewardship. Basically, be responsible with the country's finances. Third, and this one is huge, is one nation conservatism. The idea that the government actually has a responsibility to tackle inequality to keep society stable and cohesive. And fourth, empowerment. The belief that the state can and should play a role in helping both businesses and people thrive. As you can probably tell, this is a million miles away from the small government, hands-off approach of American conservatism.
All right, so we've dug into the philosophical roots of both American and British conservatism. Now let's see how these different approaches actually play out in the real world. Let's compare where they stand on some of today's biggest issues. This comment from a Reddit user is just perfect. It perfectly captures the massive gap between the two movements. The idea that a UK conservative would fit in better with the Democrats than the Republicans. It sounds crazy at first, but honestly, when you start looking at the policies, it actually starts to make a weird kind of sense. And this really lays it all out in black and white. Let's just run through it. Religion and politics? It's absolutely central in the US, but it's mostly a private affair in the UK. What about the social safety net? American conservatives are generally very skeptical of it, while British conservatives fully accept things like the National Health Service. And then you get to the big social issues like abortion and guns. There are these huge ongoing battles in the States. In the UK, a lot of those debates are largely considered settled. It all boils down to this. For American conservatives, the ultimate goal is protecting individual liberty. For their British counterparts, it's all about maintaining national stability in institutions. So, after this whole journey through these two very different worlds of conservatism, where does that leave us? What's the real takeaway here? I think the most important thing to remember is that a word like conservative is not some universal, one-size-fits-all label. Its meaning is totally shaped by the unique history, culture, and context of a country. So the next time you hear someone talking about what conservatives believe, it's worth asking, hold on, which conservatives are we actually talking about? Okay, so let's do a quick recap. What are the big things to take away from all this? First, American conservatism is this unique, paradoxical movement dedicated to preserving the liberal ideas of the 18th century. Second, British conservatism is a much more pragmatic, flexible tradition that's really focused on stability and social harmony. And finally, these deep-seated differences have huge real-world consequences, affecting everything from healthcare policy to foreign affairs. Understanding this split is just crucial for making sense of politics in both countries. And that kind of brings us to our final thought. If a single, seemingly simple word like conservative can hide such vast and contradictory meanings, what does that tell us about the way we talk about politics? Are the labels we use actually helping us understand the world, or are they sometimes just getting in the way?